The relentless noon sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestone streets of downtown Chicago, casting irregular shadows that danced chaotically between the countless vendor stalls and food carts that lined every corner. The humid summer air was thick with an overwhelming mixture of scents: fried onions from hot dog stands, wilted roses from flower vendors, fresh bread from corner bakeries, and that unmistakable aroma that dense crowds carry when desperate hopes and crushing despair mix together in equal, suffocating measure. James Rodriguez carefully adjusted his expensive Italian silk tie as he navigated through the overwhelming multitude of people, feeling completely and utterly out of place in his meticulously tailored $3,000 charcoal gray business suit. His handcrafted English leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the uneven, weathered pavement with an increasingly nervous tempo, almost as if they were desperately trying to hurry him out of this unfamiliar environment as quickly as humanly possible. He had reluctantly ventured into this bustling downtown area for an absolutely unavoidable last-minute business meeting with an important client who had stubbornly insisted on conducting their discussion in this particular authentic and culturally rich neighborhood. Now, standing amid the chaos and overwhelming sensory assault, he found himself deeply regretting his decision to accommodate this unusual request. This regret wasn't born from any sense of contempt or superiority toward the hard-working people who made their living in these busy streets. Quite the contrary, actually. Rather, it stemmed from the uncomfortable reality that every weathered face he encountered, every tired smile he glimpsed, every weathered hand he observed seemed to trigger unwelcome memories from a particular period of his life that he had spent the better part of 2 decades desperately trying to forget, bury, and move beyond completely. James Michael Rodriguez was 52 years old, though his appearance suggested someone considerably younger, thanks to his religiously maintained strict exercise routine, carefully monitored diet supervised by expensive private nutritionists, and regular visits to the most exclusive health specialists money could buy. His distinguished salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled and combed back without so much as a single rebellious strand daring to fall out of place. His piercing emerald green eyes maintained that particular hard, calculating expression he had painstakingly learned to develop and perfect during countless years of ruthless business negotiations, hostile corporate takeovers, and cutthroat boardroom battles. He was precisely the type of commanding, intimidating man who could walk into any corporate boardroom in America and immediately command absolute respect and undivided attention from everyone present. However, here in this vibrant, chaotic environment filled with street merchants, informal workers, and families struggling to make ends meet, he simply appeared lost, confused, and completely out of his element, like an expensive fish swimming desperately in entirely unfamiliar waters. While impatiently waiting for the traffic light to change at a particularly crowded and noisy intersection, his wandering gaze fell almost absent-mindedly on a diverse group of children who were playing energetically near a badly deteriorated public fountain that had clearly seen much better days. Some of these kids wore school uniforms that were clean but obviously worn thin from countless washings and years of use. Others were dressed in clothes that, while neat and tidy, had clearly been passed down through multiple owners and had witnessed far better days in their long history. Despite their varying circumstances and the obvious economic challenges their families faced, all of these children shared that seemingly inexhaustible, boundless energy and infectious joy that universally characterizes childhood innocence, regardless of their individual circumstances, family situations, or socioeconomic backgrounds. That's when he saw something that would change his life forever. At first, James genuinely thought his eyes were playing some kind of cruel, impossible joke on him. Among the group of playing children, there was one particular boy who appeared to be approximately 8 or 9 years old. He had thick, unruly black hair that looked like it hadn't seen a proper comb in several days, and his cherubic face was smudged with dirt and grime from an afternoon of carefree play and exploration. This boy was running and laughing joyfully among his companions, completely lost in the pure happiness of childhood games. But it was what he wore around his slender neck that caused James to feel as if the entire world had suddenly, inexplicably stopped spinning on its axis. Time itself seemed to slow down to an impossible crawl. All the bustling street sounds around him faded into a distant, meaningless murmur, and his heart began pounding with a terrifying force he hadn't experienced since that absolutely devastating day, exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. Hanging delicately from the boy's neck, catching and reflecting the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate through the thick leaves of a massive old oak tree. Nearby was his beloved daughter's necklace. Not something that merely resembled his daughter's necklace, not something that looked somewhat similar to what she used to wear, but exactly, unmistakably, and indisputably the very same piece of jewelry he himself had carefully selected and purchased in a tiny, cramped jewelry store tucked away in a narrow Parisian side street during his romantic honeymoon with Maria 24 wonderful years ago. It was the exact same delicate white, gold butterfly pendant with its intricately detailed wings spread wide in eternal flight, featuring the same precise arrangement of tiny diamonds that formed a completely unique pattern that had been specially designed by the French jeweler, set on the same impossibly thin but surprisingly strong chain that Maria had specifically insisted must be long enough so that someday, when they were blessed with children, she could lend it to their future daughter. And that's exactly what had happened. Just as Maria had dreamed, their precious Sophie had worn that necklace faithfully since she was 5 years old. First as an adorable game to look exactly like mommy, then gradually as her favorite accessory that she absolutely refused to take off for any reason, and finally as her most treasured lucky charm during the difficult final years of her tragically short but incredibly meaningful life. Even during the most brutal and exhausting chemotherapy treatments, when she had lost every strand of her beautiful, flowing chestnut brown hair, Sophie had adamantly refused to remove the necklace. "It's what keeps me connected to you and Mom," she'd explained to him one quiet afternoon, while the three of them watched her favorite Disney movie together in her sterile hospital room, her small hand instinctively reaching up to touch the butterfly pendant. "As long as I have this on, we'll always be together, no matter what happens." The necklace had been buried with her, just as she would have wanted. James had personally insisted on that specific detail and had supervised every single aspect of the funeral arrangements to ensure his daughter's final wishes were honored completely. He had painstakingly chosen the most beautiful, elegant casket money could buy, had hired the city's most renowned florists to create breathtaking arrangements, and had given extremely specific, detailed instructions that Sophie be laid to rest wearing her favorite pale blue dress with tiny white flowers, her cherished white ballet shoes that she had worn to countless recitals, and most importantly, the butterfly necklace that had become such an integral part of her identity that removing it would have been unthinkable. It had been the very last thing he could do for his beloved daughter, the final gift he could offer her, the absolute guarantee that she would rest peacefully for all eternity with the object that had brought her the most comfort and joy during her difficult battle with cancer. But there it was, impossibly, inexplicably hanging around the neck of a complete stranger, a child he had never seen before, in the middle of a dusty downtown street, looking exactly as beautiful and meaningful as it had the day it was buried, as if it had never spent a single moment underground. James felt his legs beginning to tremble uncontrollably beneath him. His hands, which had always remained perfectly steady during even the most high-pressure business presentations and crucial negotiations, began to sweat with cold perspiration. The Italian silk tie around his neck suddenly felt suffocatingly tight. The humid summer air seemed impossibly thick and difficult to breathe, and the entire world around him took on a surreal, dreamlike quality that made him question his own sanity. He stumbled backward and leaned heavily against the rough brick wall of a nearby building, desperately trying to regain some semblance of composure while continuing to stare in absolute disbelief at the boy who continued playing with innocent joy, completely unaware of the emotional earthquake he had just triggered in a complete stranger. The child couldn't possibly be more than 8 or 9 years old at most. He was noticeably thin, possessing that particular type of slight build that subtly but clearly spoke of frequently missed meals and uncertain dinner prospects. But his dark brown eyes absolutely sparkled with an infectious liveliness and inner strength that stood in sharp contrast to his obviously challenging living situation. His clothes were impeccably clean and had been carefully mended in several places with different colored thread, showing someone cared enough to maintain them properly despite limited resources. His worn sneakers had clearly walked countless miles on harsh city streets and had definitely seen far too many difficult days, but they were tied neatly and appeared to be the best footwear available to him. However, there was something truly remarkable in his manner of moving, in the confident way he interacted with the other children around him, that spoke eloquently of an intact personal dignity and an unbroken spirit that even his obviously difficult circumstances had not managed to crush or diminish in any way. The necklace hung slightly loose around his thin neck, resting lower than it should have ideally, but the boy wore it with a kind of careful, cautious pride, as if he was intuitively aware that he possessed something genuinely special and meaningful, even though he might not fully understand exactly why or how it had come to be in his possession. James began walking slowly, almost mechanically toward the boy, each deliberate step echoing in his ears like thunder during a violent storm. He had absolutely no idea what he was going to say or how he could possibly begin to explain this impossible situation without sounding like he had completely lost his mind. How do you approach a child and tell him that the necklace he's wearing actually belonged to your daughter who died 3 years ago? How do you explain that this precious object should be resting peacefully in San Gabriel Cemetery, not adorning the neck of a strange child on an ordinary summer afternoon? When James finally managed to position himself close enough to speak, he cleared his throat gently and nervously. The boy immediately turned toward him with natural curiosity, but without any trace of fear or suspicion, which spoke very well of his upbringing and the quality of care he had received, despite the obvious economic challenges his family clearly faced on a daily basis. "Excuse me," James said, his voice emerging far more hoarse and strained than he had intended or planned. "That beautiful necklace you're wearing, I was wondering, where did you get it?" The boy's reaction was immediate and instinctive. He quickly brought his small hand up to cover the delicate butterfly pendant with a distinctly protective gesture, and his intelligent eyes, which James could now see, were a deep, rich brown color, beautifully flecked with distinctive golden highlights, immediately filled with unmistakable wariness and caution. "Why do you want to know?" the boy asked, his young voice clear and strong, but carrying an unmistakable note of defiance. "I didn't steal it, if that's what you're thinking. I would never steal anything from anyone." The directness and dignity of the boy's response caught James completely off guard and reminded him powerfully of something or someone, though he couldn't quite place the memory. There was something in the precise way the child had spoken those words, a fierce pride and moral certainty that seemed somehow deeply familiar. No, please don't misunderstand me," James quickly clarified, raising both hands in what he hoped was a peaceful, non-threatening gesture. "I absolutely don't think you stole anything. It's just that this particular necklace is very special to me personally. It looks remarkably similar to one that I knew and loved a long time ago." The boy studied James intently with those remarkably intelligent eyes that seemed far too old and wise for his young face. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, he gradually relaxed his defensive posture slightly, though he remained obviously cautious. "My grandmother gave it to me before she died," he said finally, his voice softer now, but still carrying that underlying strength. "She told me it had belonged to my mother when she was little, and now it was mine to keep forever. It's the only thing I have left of her." James felt as if someone had delivered a devastating punch directly to his stomach, knocking all the air from his lungs. Your mother?" "Yes," the boy nodded with solemn dignity. "That was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She died when I was born. My grandmother raised me by herself until about 2 months ago, when she also went to heaven to be with my mom. Now I live with Mrs. Martha at the children's home on Hope Street, but it's not the same as having real family." Every single word the boy spoke was like a crucial piece of an impossible puzzle that was slowly beginning to form a picture James didn't want to, begin to fully comprehend. His rational, analytical mind fought desperately against the avalanche of incredible possibilities that were opening before him like a dark, bottomless abyss. "What was your mother's name?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though he was terrified of what the answer might reveal. The boy hesitated for a long moment, clearly debating whether this elegantly dressed stranger deserved to know such deeply personal and sacred information about his family. "Maria," he said finally, the name carrying all the love and longing of a child who had never known his mother, but cherished her memory. Her name was Maria Herrera. The world came to a complete and total stop. James had to grab the rough brick wall again to prevent himself from collapsing entirely. Maria Herrera had been his wife's maiden name before their marriage. Maria Herrera had been the name she had carried during the early blissful years of their relationship before she became Maria Rodriguez. Maria Herrera had been the name carefully engraved on her marble headstone when she died in the same horrific automobile accident that had also claimed their precious Sophie's life. But this was completely impossible. Absolutely, utterly impossible. Maria had died alongside Sophie exactly 3 years, 2 months and 16 days ago in that terrible collision on the highway leading to their favorite coastal vacation spot. He had stood beside 2 matching coffins at the funeral home, had attended 2 heartbreaking burial services on the same devastating day, had experienced the kind of soul-crushing pain that had literally split him in 2 and left him barely able to function as a human being. Maria had never had any other children besides Sophie. They had tried desperately for several years after Sophie's birth, consulting with the best fertility specialists money could buy, but the doctors had been absolutely clear and definitive. Serious complications during Sophie's delivery had made another pregnancy completely impossible. They had seriously considered adoption, had lengthy discussions about expensive fertility treatments and experimental procedures, but Sophie had filled their lives so completely and brought them such overwhelming joy that they had eventually decided their family was perfect exactly as it was. And yet, here was this boy, this impossible child, wearing Sophie's necklace and claiming his mother had been named Maria Herrera. "Do you happen to know how old your mother was when she died?" James asked, his voice trembling in a way he hadn't experienced even during the darkest, most devastating days immediately following the accident. The boy wrinkled his forehead in concentration, clearly trying to recall specific details his grandmother had shared with him. "Grandma always said she was 18 years old when I was born. She used to tell me that Mum was very young, but that she loved me more than anything in the whole world, even though she couldn't take care of me herself." 18 years old. James's mind immediately began performing rapid calculations. 9 years ago, his Maria would have been exactly 18 years younger than she was when she died in the accident. The age was precisely correct. The name was exactly right. And most impossibly, there was the necklace. The damned beautiful, impossible necklace that should have been buried 6 feet underground, but was hanging around this mysterious boy's neck like some kind of silent accusation or divine message. "What about your grandmother?" James asked, though he was no longer entirely sure he wanted to hear any more answers. "What was your grandmother's name?" "Rosa Herrera," the boy answered without hesitation, his voice carrying deep affection and unmistakable grief. "She was incredibly kind to me and took amazing care of me, but she always got very sad whenever she talked about my mom. She used to say that my mother had made a very big mistake when she was young and naive, but that I should never blame myself for the mistakes that adults make." Rosa Herrera. The name triggered a vague but definitely real memory in James's mind. He could dimly recall a woman with that exact name, a quiet, hard-working domestic employee who had worked in his house for a brief period many years ago. Maria had insisted on hiring her, saying she looked like someone who really needed a good opportunity and a chance to prove herself. But this woman had disappeared completely and mysteriously overnight after working for them for only a few months, leaving without any explanation, forwarding address, or even a goodbye note. James remembered that Maria had been strangely and deeply affected by Rosa's sudden departure, asking about her repeatedly in the weeks that followed, and seeming genuinely worried about her welfare. That had been... James performed the mental calculations once again, exactly 10 years ago, almost to the month. The pieces of this incredible puzzle were beginning to fit together in a way that made James feel physically nauseated and emotionally overwhelmed. A domestic worker named Rosa Herrera, who had worked in his house exactly 10 years ago. An 18-year-old girl named Maria Herrera, who had died giving birth to a child 9 years ago. A necklace that had belonged to his dead daughter Sophie, now somehow in the possession of that same child, and at the center of this impossible situation was his late wife Maria, who had been behaving strangely during exactly that time period. Maria, who had insisted on hiring Rosa, despite having no real need for additional household help. Maria, who had been emotionally distant and preoccupied for months after the woman's mysterious departure. Maria, who had begun leaving the house more frequently during that period, always with perfectly reasonable explanations that now, viewed in this new light, seemed suspiciously convenient and potentially deceptive. "Are you hungry?" James asked the boy, his mind racing at full speed while he struggled to process all of this overwhelming information. He desperately needed time to think clearly, to ask more questions, to try to understand what was happening to his carefully ordered world. The boy nodded with touching honesty. "I'm always hungry," he admitted with the kind of brutal, matter-of-fact honesty that only children possess. "There's never quite enough food at the home, and we're not allowed to ask for seconds. Would you like to come with me to get some lunch? I know a place nearby that serves the best pizza in the entire city, and you can order whatever you want." For the first time since their conversation had begun, the boy's entire face lit up with a genuine, radiant smile that transformed his features completely. "Really? You're not joking with me?" "Adults sometimes say things they don't mean. I'm absolutely not joking," James assured him, surprised by the wave of protective tenderness he felt toward this unknown child who wore his dead daughter's necklace and might be... No, it was still far too early to allow himself to think about that particular possibility. "What's your name?" James asked as they began walking together toward the restaurant he had mentioned. "Matthew," the boy replied, unconsciously adjusting the necklace around his neck with a gesture that was so familiar it made James's heart skip a beat. "Matthew Herrera. It's very nice to meet you, Matthew. My name is James." "James what? Don't you have a last name too?" James hesitated for several seconds, uncertain how to respond. Something told him that revealing his full name might trigger reactions and complications he wasn't prepared to handle just yet. "Just James for now," he said carefully. "Sometimes it's better to get to know someone a little bit before sharing everything about yourself." The restaurant James had chosen was one of those comfortable, unpretentious middle-class establishments that he normally wouldn't even notice during his busy daily routine. However, it now seemed absolutely perfect for the kind of conversation that could potentially change everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and his past. It was a small but cozy place with well-worn wooden tables that had clearly hosted thousands of meals and conversations, and red and white checkered tablecloths that had definitely seen better days, but were spotlessly clean and obviously cared for with pride. Matthew entered the restaurant with his eyes opened impossibly wide, clearly overwhelmed and impressed by what was, to James, a very modest establishment, but which obviously represented an almost unimaginable luxury to this child who had grown up with so little. The way Matthew observed every detail of his surroundings, the framed photographs on the walls, the cheerful decorations, the other families enjoying their meals, with that particular mixture of wonder and carefully contained dignity, made James feel a sharp, unexpected pain in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sophie was very young. They settled at a corner table near a large window where the warm afternoon sunlight created a pleasant, inviting atmosphere that stood in sharp contrast to the emotional storm raging inside James's mind and heart. Matthew sat carefully on the very edge of his chair, as if he wasn't completely sure this experience was real or whether it might disappear at any moment like a dream. "Please, order absolutely anything you want," James said, handing Matthew the laminated menu with an encouraging smile. "Don't worry about the price. Just choose whatever looks good to you." Matthew studied the menu with the intense seriousness of a scholar examining an ancient, precious manuscript. "Anything at all. Anything at all. Even Hawaiian pizza?" Matthew asked, pronouncing the word Hawaiian with the kind of reverent, almost magical tone that someone might use when describing something mythical and wonderful. James couldn't help but smile at the pure joy and amazement in the boy's voice. "Especially Hawaiian pizza, if that's what you'd like." While they waited for their food to arrive, James found himself observing Matthew with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He studied every gesture, every facial expression, every subtle inflection in the boy's voice, desperately searching for similarities, differences, or any clue that might confirm or deny the impossible suspicions that were growing in his mind like persistent weeds. The boy had thick, naturally curly black hair, exactly like Maria had possessed when she was young, before she began straightening and styling it for social events and business functions. His eyes were that same distinctive deep brown color, beautifully highlighted with golden flecks that James remembered admiring in his wife during their early years together when they were young and deeply in love. The shape of Matthew's hands, long, slender, and graceful, also reminded him powerfully of Maria's hands. But beyond these physical characteristics, there was something deeper in the boy's manner of being, a distinctive combination of quiet determination and vulnerable sensitivity that was almost painfully familiar. "Matthew," James said as carefully as possible, "did your grandmother ever tell you anything else about your mother? What kind of person she was, what she enjoyed doing, what made her happy?" Matthew chewed thoughtfully on a bite of his pizza before responding, clearly considering his words carefully. "Grandma Rosa used to say that my mum was incredibly beautiful, both inside and outside, but that she was also very sad most of the time. She told me that my mother had fallen in love with someone who couldn't love her back the same way, and that's why she had to go away when I was born." Every single word felt like a sharp knife cutting directly into James's heart. He felt the air in the restaurant becoming thick and difficult to breathe. Someone who couldn't love her back? Yes. Matthew nodded with that solemn maturity that children develop when they've been forced to confront adult problems far too early. Grandma explained that my father was married to another woman, and that's why they couldn't be together like a normal family. But she always made sure I knew that he was basically a good person, just that the situation was very complicated and impossible. The world began spinning violently around James, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. The implications of what he was hearing were absolutely monumental, potentially devastating, and almost too overwhelming to process completely. If what he was beginning to suspect was actually true, then his entire life, his entire marriage, every memory he cherished of Maria and Sophie, all of his grief and pain over their tragic loss, everything was built on a foundation of lies so massive and fundamental that it threatened to destroy the very core of his identity and understanding of himself. Maria had had an extramarital affair. Not only that, but she had conceived and given birth to a child from that relationship. A child who had been raised in complete secrecy by his grandmother, while James had lived for 9 entire years in complete ignorance of his existence. And somehow, impossibly, Sophie's treasured necklace had ended up in this boy's possession, almost as if Maria had wanted to maintain some kind of spiritual connection between her 2 children, the one she had acknowledged and raised, and the one she had been forced to keep secret. But why would Maria have done something like this? Their marriage hadn't been perfect, no marriage ever is, but it had been fundamentally solid, built on genuine love and mutual respect. They had loved each other deeply and had worked together to overcome the disappointment and grief of not being able to have more children after Sophie. They had built what seemed to be a comfortable, stable, respectable life, filled with countless small daily joys and shared experiences. Or had they? Had it all been an elaborate facade? James began mentally reviewing those crucial years with new eyes, desperately searching for signs he had missed, clues he had been too trusting or naive to recognize. He thought about Maria's unexplained absences, the periods of inexplicable melancholy that he had attributed to the natural stress of motherhood and the disappointment over their fertility struggles. He remembered the occasions when he had found her crying softly for no apparent reason, and she had dismissed his concerns by saying she was just being overly sentimental. And then there was Maria's behavior during the final years before the accident. She had seemed more affectionate toward him, more attentive to his needs, almost as if she were trying to compensate for something or make amends for some unspoken guilt. She had insisted they take more family photographs, plan more elaborate vacations, spend more intensive quality time together as a family unit. At the time, James had interpreted this as a natural and healthy evolution of their marriage, a renewal of their commitment to each other after working through the challenges of their fertility struggles. Now he wondered with growing horror whether it had been motivated by guilt and a desperate attempt to assuage her conscience. "Are you feeling okay?" Matthew asked with genuine concern, noticing that James had stopped eating entirely and was staring out the window with a distant, troubled expression. "You look kind of sick." "I'm fine, sorry." James forced himself to return to the present moment. "I was just thinking about some things. Matthew, do you happen to have any photographs of your mother that you could show me?" Matthew shook his head sadly. Grandma Rosa had one beautiful picture of her, but it got lost when we had to move to a smaller apartment the last time. She was really pretty in that photo. She had long, shiny hair and was smiling this amazing smile. Grandma always said that my smile was exactly like my mom's. James found himself studying Matthew's smile with new intensity and felt another sharp stab of recognition pierce his heart. There was indeed something in that particular expression that seemed profoundly familiar to him, not identical to Maria's smile, but somehow perfectly complementary, like a variation on the same beautiful musical theme. "Matthew," James said, making what he knew could be the most important and life-changing decision of his entire existence. "Would you be interested in coming with me to a special place? There's something there that I'd very much like to show you." The boy looked at him with curiosity, but without any trace of fear or suspicion. "What kind of place are you talking about?" "It's a place where I keep photographs and memories, pictures of people who might have known you when you were very small, before you can remember." It wasn't exactly a lie. But it certainly wasn't the complete truth either. James had decided to take Matthew to his house in the suburbs. He needed to see how the boy would react when confronted with Maria's photographs, when surrounded by the environment where he might very well have been conceived. He desperately needed answers and felt instinctively that he would only obtain them by confronting this situation directly and completely. The drive in James's luxury sedan to the exclusive residential neighborhood where he lived passed in contemplative silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable quiet. Matthew gazed through the tinted windows with obvious fascination, watching with amazement as the urban landscape gradually transformed before his eyes. The streets progressively became wider and cleaner, lined with mature trees and well-maintained landscaping. The houses grew dramatically in size and obvious expense. The carefully manicured gardens became increasingly elaborate and professionally designed, and the cars parked in circular driveways became progressively newer, larger, and more expensive. Do all of these enormous houses really belong to just one family each? Matthew asked in wonder as they entered James's neighborhood. Yes, they do, James replied, becoming suddenly and uncomfortably aware of the stark contrast between his privileged world and the reality this child had always known. It must be incredibly quiet and peaceful living in a place like this, Matthew observed thoughtfully. At the children's home, there's always noise, kids crying, people arguing, doors slamming. Sometimes I really miss having quiet places to think. James's house was a perfect example of understated but unmistakable elegance and success. It was a sprawling two-story structure built in a modern colonial style, surrounded by professionally maintained gardens and featuring a facade that spoke eloquently of significant financial success without crossing the line into ostentatious display. It was exactly the type of house that regularly appeared in upscale architectural and interior design magazines, where every single element had been carefully selected and positioned to create an overall impression of harmony, sophistication, and refined taste. Matthew followed James to the imposing front entrance, his young eyes absorbing and cataloging every detail of this unfamiliar environment. When they stepped inside, the boy stood completely motionless in the spacious marble foyer, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude, beauty, and obvious expense of everything around him. "This is the most beautiful house I've ever seen," he whispered reverently, as if speaking in a normal voice might somehow damage or disturb something precious. James led Matthew into the main living area, where the walls were covered with an extensive collection of family photographs spanning many years. There were decades worth of captured happy moments displayed in elegant silver frames. Wedding photos, birthday celebrations, family vacations to exotic locations, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies. The progression of images told the story of James and Maria as a young couple deeply in love. Maria, during her pregnancy with Sophie, looking radiant and expectant. Baby Sophie, toddler Sophie. Sophie growing up before the camera with that luminous, infectious smile that had brought such joy and light to their lives for 15 precious but far too brief years. James watched Matthew's reaction with intense attention as the boy slowly examined the photographs. Initially, there was only polite curiosity in his expression, the look of someone observing the happy memories of strangers. But when Matthew's gaze settled on one particular photograph of Maria, James witnessed a dramatic change in the boy's demeanor and body language. It was a candid photograph James had taken during a romantic beach vacation approximately 12 years earlier. Maria was sitting gracefully on the white sand, with her long dark hair flowing freely in the ocean breeze, wearing a simple but elegant white sundress. Around her neck was the butterfly necklace that would later become Sophie's most treasured possession. The golden light of the setting sun bathed her in an almost ethereal glow that made her appear angelic and timeless. Matthew approached that specific photograph as if drawn by some invisible magnetic force. His small hand rose instinctively toward the necklace hanging around his own neck, as he studied the image with an intensity that made James hold his breath in anticipation. "She looks exactly like my mom," Matthew murmured, his voice barely audible but filled with wonder and recognition. Grandma Rosa was absolutely right. They look so much alike, it's almost scary. James felt his knees becoming weak and unsteady. "Do you really think so?" "Oh yes, especially when she smiles like that. And look," Matthew pointed excitedly at the necklace visible in the photograph. "She's wearing the exact same necklace I have. Was she your mom or something?" The innocent, direct question hit James with the force of a sledgehammer blow. How could he possibly answer such a question? How could he explain to a 9-year-old child that the woman in the photograph wasn't his mother, but rather the wife of the man who was quite possibly his biological father? How could he tell this boy that the woman had died along with her daughter in a tragic accident, but that before her death she had apparently given birth to a secret son she had kept hidden from her husband for years? "It's extremely complicated," James said finally, his voice barely steady. Matthew nodded with that precocious wisdom that children develop when they've been forced to deal with far too many complicated adult situations at too young an age. "Everything about grown-ups is always complicated," he said with a maturity that simultaneously broke James's heart and filled him with admiration. "That's what Grandma Rosa used to tell me all the time whenever I asked difficult questions." James sank heavily onto the leather sofa, suddenly feeling every one of his 52 years weighing on his shoulders. Matthew continued his careful examination of the photographs, pausing particularly long at those showing Maria wearing the butterfly necklace. "What was her name?" Matthew asked softly. "Maria," James replied, his voice thick with emotion and barely controlled grief. "Just like my mom," Matthew said quietly, his voice filled with wonder at the coincidence. "Do you think that's just a coincidence? Or do you think it means something special?" "I don't believe in coincidences," James said, and as the words left his mouth, he realized they were absolutely true. Far too many elements had aligned perfectly for this to be mere chance. The necklace, the identical names, the precisely matching dates, the interconnected circumstances. The universe was clearly trying to communicate something vitally important to him, and he was finally beginning to listen carefully to its message. "Matthew," James said, making what he knew was the most difficult and potentially life-altering decision of his entire existence, "I need to tell you something extremely important, but before I do that, I need to ask you a very serious question. Is that okay with you?" The boy turned toward him with those remarkably intelligent eyes that seemed capable of looking directly into a person's soul and seeing the truth hidden there. "Okay," Matthew said simply, but with complete trust. "Have you ever wondered about your father? Have you ever thought about who he might be or what he might be like?" Matthew immediately looked down at his hands, nervously fidgeting with the worn edge of his carefully mended shirt, while he considered how to respond to such a deeply personal question. "Every single day," he admitted with heartbreaking honesty. "I think about him all the time, wondering what he looks like, what kind of work he does, whether he likes the same foods I like, if he's tall or short, if he has my eyes or my nose. Grandma Rosa never wanted to tell me very much about him. She would only say that he was a fundamentally good person who couldn't take care of me because of his circumstances, but that he would have loved me very much if he had been able to." James felt his throat constricting with overwhelming emotion. "And what do you think about that? Would you want to meet him if it were possible?" Matthew raised his gaze, and James saw tears beginning to glisten in the boy's expressive brown eyes, though he was fighting valiantly to keep them from falling. "More than anything else in the whole world," Matthew whispered with raw, desperate longing. "I've always dreamed of having a real dad, someone who would teach me how to throw a baseball, help me with my homework, come to school events, and just be there when I need him. I want to know if I inherited anything from him besides just his looks. But Grandma Rosa always said it was completely impossible." "Why did she say it was impossible?" because he already had a different family, a real proper family with a wife and a daughter who lived with him every day. And she said that my mom and we were the mistake that couldn't be fixed. The word mistake, spoken in the trembling voice of a 9-year-old boy who had never known the love of a father, cut through James like a razor-sharp blade. Without thinking, without hesitation, he immediately rose from the sofa and approached Matthew, kneeling down in front of him so they would be at the same eye level. "Listen to me very carefully, Matthew," James said with fierce intensity, gently taking the boy's small, delicate hands in his own much larger ones. "You are not a mistake. You have never been a mistake, and you never will be a mistake. You are an intelligent, kind, brave, wonderful boy, and any man in the world would consider himself incredibly fortunate and blessed to be your father." Matthew looked at him with a complex mixture of desperate hope and learned skepticism, an expression that spoke eloquently of too many broken adult promises and disappointments in his young life. "Do you really, truly mean that?" "I mean it with every fiber of my being." James took a deep, steadying breath, preparing himself to speak the words that would irrevocably change both of their lives forever. "Matthew, I have something very important to tell you. I strongly believe that the man your grandmother told you about, the father who couldn't take care of you, I think that man is me." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening and seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Matthew didn't move so much as a single muscle, didn't speak, barely seemed to breathe. His young eyes locked onto James's face with an intensity that was almost painful to bear. "You?" Matthew repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper that seemed to float in the emotionally charged air between them. James nodded slowly and deliberately, feeling as though he were leaping from the edge of a towering cliff without knowing whether there was a safety net waiting to catch him below. "I believe so. Yes. Your grandmother, Rosa Herrera, worked in this house approximately 10 years ago, and the woman in all these photographs, Maria, was my wife." Matthew processed this stunning information in complete silence, his intelligent eyes moving back and forth between James's face and the family photographs covering the walls. James could practically see the mental gears turning in the boy's mind as he tried to connect dots and puzzle pieces he had probably been attempting to fit together for years without having sufficient information. Does that mean she was my real mom?" Matthew asked finally, pointing toward the beach photograph of Maria. James felt as though all the air had been forcibly expelled from his lungs. "No, son. Maria was my wife, but she wasn't your biological mother. Your mother was also named Maria, but she was a different person, a young woman who worked for us." "I don't understand any of this," Matthew said, his brow furrowing with confusion and frustration. James realized he had made a significant error in judgment. The situation was far too complex and emotionally fraught to explain to a child in this manner, especially when he himself was only beginning to grasp the complete implications and ramifications. "Come here, sit with me," James said gently, indicating the comfortable sofa. "I want to tell you a story that will help explain everything. Is that all right?" Matthew nodded earnestly and settled beside James, maintaining a careful but not unfriendly distance. 10 years ago, James began, choosing his words with extreme care, a young woman named Rosa Herrera came to work at this house as our housekeeper. She was quiet and hardworking, and she had an 18-year-old daughter who was also named Maria. One day, without any explanation or warning, Rosa disappeared completely. She left no forwarding address, no goodbye note, nothing. We never understood why she left so suddenly. James paused, closely observing Matthew's reaction. The boy was listening with absolute rapt attention, as if his very life depended on understanding every single word. Now, looking back, I think Rosa left because her daughter Maria was going to have a baby. And that baby was, James hesitated, uncertain how to continue. Was yours? Matthew asked, with that brutal, unflinching honesty that only children possess. James felt the world tilting dangerously around him. "It's very possible," he admitted finally. "I didn't know about it at the time. If I had known, what would you have done?" Matthew's question was simple, but loaded with desperate need to understand and hope for reassurance. "I honestly don't know," James said with complete honesty. "It would have been an incredibly difficult and complicated situation for everyone involved. But what I absolutely do know is that I never would have abandoned you. I never would have allowed you to grow up thinking you were unwanted or that your existence was a mistake." Matthew lowered his gaze to the butterfly necklace hanging around his neck, touching it gently with his fingertips as if drawing strength from it. "But then why do I have this?" he asked with heartbreaking confusion. "If the Mrs. Maria in the pictures wasn't my mom, why would I have her necklace? How did it get from her to me?" That was precisely the question that had been tormenting James since the moment he first saw the necklace. How had Sophie's treasured necklace, which had been buried with her, ended up in Matthew's possession? He had personally supervised that detail of the funeral arrangements. "I don't know the answer to that question yet," James admitted honestly, "but I promise you this. I'm going to find out. I'm going to investigate until I understand exactly how this happened." Matthew raised his eyes to meet James's gaze, and James saw something in those depths that reminded him painfully of Sophie, a complex mixture of hope and fear, trust and caution that spoke of a heart that had been hurt repeatedly, but still possessed the courage to hope. "Does this mean you might actually be my dad?" Matthew asked in a voice so quiet that James had to strain to hear him. "It's very possible," James said carefully, "but to know for certain, we would need to have some medical tests performed. Do you know what a DNA test is?" Matthew shook his head. "It's a simple blood test that can tell us definitively whether we're related. Would you be willing to do that? Will it hurt very much?" "Very little. About the same as getting a vaccination at the doctor's office." Matthew considered this proposition seriously for several moments. "And if the test shows that you really are my father, what would happen then? What would that mean for both of us?" The question struck James like a physical blow. He hadn't allowed himself to think beyond the moment of revelation and confirmation. What would he do if Matthew turned out to be his biological son? His entire life was rigidly structured around his demanding career, his carefully maintained solitude, and his ongoing grief over losing Maria and Sophie. He had no emotional space or practical arrangements for a 9-year-old boy who had grown up in circumstances completely different from anything he could offer. But looking at Matthew now, seeing the vulnerability and desperate hope in those eyes that he was beginning to recognize as his own, James felt something stirring within him that he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. The possibility of a future that wasn't defined exclusively by the pain and emptiness of the past. "If the test confirms that I'm your father," James said slowly, thinking carefully about each word, "then we'll do whatever is necessary to make sure we can be together, like a real family should be. Even though I'm poor and don't know how to behave properly in fancy places like this." The question absolutely shattered James's heart. "Especially then," he said with fierce conviction. "Being a family has nothing to do with money or knowing proper etiquette. It's about loving each other and taking care of each other, no matter what challenges we face." Matthew nodded with solemn gravity, as if he were sealing a sacred pact. "Can we do the test tomorrow?" he asked eagerly. James smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile he had experienced in months. "Absolutely. But for tonight, what do you say we have some dinner? It's getting late, and I'm sure you must be hungry again." While preparing a simple but nutritious dinner in his spacious, well-equipped kitchen, James found himself observing Matthew as the boy cautiously explored this unfamiliar environment. Matthew touched each surface with obvious reverence and wonder, as if he were visiting a museum filled with priceless artifacts. Despite his clearly limited exposure to formal, upscale environments, Matthew's manners were impeccable, and showed he had received excellent guidance from his grandmother, even under difficult circumstances. "Did she live in this house when she was little?" Matthew asked, pointing to a cheerful photograph of Sophie that was held to the refrigerator with a colorful magnet. "Yes, she did," James replied, feeling the familiar sharp pang of loss, now mixed with something that resembled nostalgic fondness. "Her name was Sophie. She was my daughter." "Was?" Matthew picked up on the past tense immediately. James paused in his dinner preparations. "She died 3 years ago, along with Maria. They were both killed in a terrible car accident." Matthew absorbed this tragic information silently for several moments, processing its implications. "Was she pretty?" "She was absolutely beautiful," James said, his voice heavy with emotion and treasured memories. "She was intelligent, funny, full of life and energy. She had the most wonderful laugh. I think she would have loved meeting you. Do you think we would have been friends?" "I think you would have been much more than friends," James said, suddenly realizing something profound for the first time. "If it turns out that you are my son, then you and Sophie would have been brother and sister." The words brother and sister hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities and emotional implications that neither of them dared to explore completely at that moment. They ate their dinner at the formal dining room table, which hadn't been used for family meals since Maria and Sophie's deaths. James typically ate alone in the kitchen, often standing at the counter, or grabbed something quick from the refrigerator when he arrived home late from work. But having Matthew there, seeing how the boy's eyes lit up with wonder at each new dish, watching him ask politely before taking additional servings, observing his careful attempts to use the proper utensils, even when he was clearly uncertain about formal dining etiquette, all of this reminded James powerfully of why this beautiful dining room had been designed for moments exactly like this. "What kind of work do you do?" Matthew asked between bites of his meal. "I'm an architect," James replied. "I design buildings, houses, office buildings, schools, hospitals." "Like this house?" "Not exactly this one. I didn't design this particular house, but I have designed many others that are similar." "Is it difficult work?" "Sometimes it can be quite challenging, but I love creating things that will last for a very long time and that will make people's lives better and more beautiful." Matthew nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing this information. "I think I'd like to do something like that someday, create beautiful things that help people." "What kind of things do you like to create now?" Matthew's cheeks flushed with modest embarrassment. "I like to draw, when I can get paper and pencils. Grandma Rosa used to say I was pretty good at it, but I don't know if she was just being nice. I'd very much like to see some of your drawings sometime. I don't have any with me right now. They're all back at the children's home, and besides..." Matthew trailed off, as if he had been about to say something he shouldn't. "Besides what?" "Besides, they're probably just silly kid drawings, nothing special. Just pictures of houses and families and things that don't really exist in real life." James felt a powerful surge of recognition and empathy. He too had filled countless sketchbooks with drawings of houses and ideal families when he was a child, especially during periods when his own parents were too busy with their careers to give him the attention he craved. He had created entire imaginary worlds on paper where families were always happy, always together, always loving. "I'd like to see them anyway," James said gently. "I have a feeling they're much more special than you think they are." After dinner, James was confronted with an immediate practical dilemma: what to do with Matthew for the night. The boy obviously couldn't return to the children's home without extensive explanations that James wasn't prepared to give, but he also wasn't entirely certain it was legally or ethically appropriate for Matthew to stay overnight at his house without first resolving the complex legal and medical questions surrounding their situation. Matthew," James said finally, "I need to make several important phone calls to arrange for tomorrow's medical test and to speak with the administrators at the home where you're living. Would it be all right with you if you stayed here tonight? I have a very comfortable guest bedroom where you could sleep." Matthew nodded agreement, but James noticed unmistakable tension in the boy's shoulders and posture. "What's troubling you?" James asked with concern. "What happens if the test results show that you're not really my father?" Matthew asked in a small, worried voice. "Will I have to go back to the home and pretend that none of this ever happened? Will I have to forget about meeting you?" The question was simultaneously so practical and so heartbreaking that James needed several moments to formulate an appropriate response. "If the test results show that I'm not your biological father," James said carefully and thoughtfully, "that absolutely doesn't mean we can't continue to be friends. It doesn't mean you have to disappear from my life or that this day didn't matter." "Really? You mean that?" "I mean it completely. But Matthew, I need you to understand something very important. Regardless of what any medical test might show, regardless of what happened in the past, you deserve to have a loving family. And if that family isn't me, then we'll work together to make sure you find the people who can give you all the love and support you deserve." Matthew nodded, but James could see that the boy wasn't entirely convinced. And how could he be? He had spent his entire young life being disappointed by well-meaning adults who made promises they ultimately couldn't or wouldn't keep. That night, James carefully set up Matthew in the spacious guest bedroom, providing him with comfortable borrowed pajamas that were comically oversized on his small frame, and tucking him into a bed that was larger and more luxurious than anything the boy had ever experienced in his short life. After ensuring that Matthew had everything he might need, extra blankets, a glass of water, books to read, a nightlight, James retreated to his own master bedroom to make the crucial phone calls he had promised. The first call was to the children's home where Matthew lived. Explaining the extraordinary situation without sounding like he had completely lost his mind proved to be significantly more challenging than James had anticipated. However, after a lengthy and sometimes tense conversation, he eventually managed to convince the facility's director that Matthew was safe and well cared for, and that he would return the following day with much more detailed information and documentation. The second call was to his personal physician, explaining that he needed an urgent and completely confidential paternity test performed. Years of being a valuable and financially significant patient proved beneficial. His doctor agreed to see them at the very earliest opportunity the following morning. The third call was by far the most difficult and emotionally charged. James dialed the number of the funeral home where Maria and Sophie had been waked and buried, specifically requesting to speak with the funeral director who had personally handled all of their arrangements. When he finally managed to reach the man, James asked the question that had been absolutely terrifying him since that afternoon. "I need you to confirm something very important about my daughter's burial 3 years ago. Was she interred with all of her personal belongings, specifically including a gold necklace with a butterfly pendant?" The extended pause that followed was far too long for James's emotional equilibrium. "Mr. Rodriguez," the funeral director finally said, his voice carrying an odd, uncertain tone, "I believe we need to discuss this matter in person, face to face. Would it be possible for you to come to my office tomorrow?" James felt his stomach plummeting toward his feet. "Is there some kind of problem with what I'm asking? It's extremely complicated. I would strongly prefer to explain everything to you in person rather than over the telephone." After ending that disturbing call, James sat on the edge of his bed feeling completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the discoveries he was making. In the span of a single afternoon, his carefully structured and predictable life had been turned completely upside down. He had a possible son sleeping in the room next door. There was mounting evidence that his late wife had harbored secrets he had never suspected. And now it appeared that even the specific details of his daughter's funeral might not be what he had believed them to be. Sleep proved completely elusive that night. James lay awake for hours, listening to the subtle sounds of his house, more acutely aware than ever of the profound silence that had filled these rooms for the past 3 years. Occasionally, he heard Matthew shifting position in the guest room, probably also struggling to sleep in such an unfamiliar and luxurious environment. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, James heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside his bedroom. He rose quietly and discovered Matthew standing motionless in front of the extensive family photograph gallery in the living room, illuminated only by the ethereal moonlight streaming through the large windows. "Having trouble sleeping?" James asked gently, not wanting to startle the boy. Matthew jumped slightly but relaxed when he saw it was James approaching. "I'm not used to so much quiet," Matthew admitted honestly. "At the children's home, there's always noise, kids coughing or talking in their sleep, Mr. Peterson snoring in the next room, people walking around. The silence here is kind of scary." James approached and stood beside Matthew, in front of the photographs, both of them studying the images of happier times. "Do you miss your grandmother very much?" James asked softly. "Every single day," Matthew replied without hesitation. "She was the only person in the world who really knew me. She knew exactly how I like my sandwiches cut, that I'm afraid of thunderstorms, that I love hearing stories before bedtime. She knew all the little things that made me feel safe and loved." "What kind of stories did you like best?" "Stories about happy families, about children who found their fathers and went to live in beautiful houses, where there was always plenty of food and nobody ever had to be afraid or lonely." James felt his throat constricting with overwhelming emotion. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" Matthew's entire face brightened with enthusiastic anticipation. They settled together on the comfortable leather sofa, and James began sharing not fictional tales, but real, precious memories. From when Sophie was young, he told Matthew about the family adventures they had experienced together. Trips to amusement parks, beach vacations, camping expeditions in national parks, cozy movie nights at home, elaborate birthday celebrations. As James spoke, he realized with surprise that this was the first time in 3 years he had talked about these treasured memories without feeling exclusively pain and loss. With Matthew listening so intently and responding with such genuine interest and delight, these recollections felt more like precious treasures than painful wounds. "Do you think Sophie would have wanted to have a brother?" Matthew asked, when James finished a particularly amusing story about a disastrous but hilarious day at the zoo where everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, but they had laughed about it for years afterward. "She asked for a little brother or sister for every birthday and every Christmas," James replied with complete honesty. "Maria and I tried for many years to give her that gift, but sometimes life doesn't work out according to our plans." Matthew considered this thoughtfully. Maybe things did happen the way they were supposed to, though. Maybe it just took much longer than anyone expected, and maybe it had to happen in a way nobody could have predicted. The simple, profound wisdom of Matthew's observation struck James like a bolt of lightning. What if the boy was absolutely right? What if everything that had occurred, Maria's affair, the secret pregnancy, the years of hidden truth, even the tragic accident that had brought them to this moment, had all been part of some larger cosmic plan that he had been unable to see or understand? "Maybe you're right," James said quietly, feeling something shift fundamentally in his understanding of recent events. Eventually, Matthew fell peacefully asleep on the sofa, curled trustingly against James's arm with the complete faith of a child who finally felt truly safe and protected. James didn't move, didn't want to disturb or break this precious moment of peace that both of them desperately needed. When the first light of dawn began filtering gently through the windows, James looked down at Matthew's sleeping face and was startled to recognize facial expressions and mannerisms he had been seeing in his own mirror for his entire adult life. The way Matthew's brow furrowed slightly while dreaming, the particular way his mouth curved to one side during sleep, even the characteristic way he positioned his hand under his cheek. Every detail was achingly, unmistakably familiar. James no longer needed to wait for official medical test results to know the truth in his heart. This remarkable boy was his son. The morning brought an entirely new series of challenges and revelations. Matthew awakened slightly disoriented but not frightened, adapting with the remarkable flexibility that characterizes children, who have learned to adjust rapidly to constantly changing situations and environments. They shared breakfast together. James prepared elaborate pancakes from scratch, something he hadn't done since Sophie was very young, and then traveled together to the medical clinic for the paternity testing. The actual medical procedure proved to be surprisingly straightforward and quick. Matthew demonstrated admirable courage during the blood draw, gripping James's hand tightly only when the needle initially punctured his arm. The laboratory results would be available within 48 hours, but the attending physician quietly confirmed to James that based purely on observable physical characteristics and family resemblances, biological paternity seemed highly probable. Following their visit to the clinic, they proceeded directly to the funeral home. James had explained to Matthew that they needed to investigate some questions about the necklace's history, but he had deliberately avoided providing specific details about what they might discover during this visit. The funeral director, Mr. Ramirez, received them in his professional office with a facial expression that James found impossible to interpret or understand. He was an elderly gentleman with several decades of experience managing the most delicate and emotionally charged situations imaginable. But he appeared particularly nervous and uncomfortable that particular morning. "Mr. Rodriguez," he began hesitantly, "before we discuss this matter, I must ask you to promise that you'll maintain an open mind about everything I'm going to tell you." James felt an ominous chill of premonition. What exactly happened? Mr. Ramirez glanced uncertainly at Matthew, obviously uncomfortable having a young child present during what promised to be a very adult and potentially disturbing conversation. "Perhaps the young man should wait outside while we talk." "He stays," James said with firm determination. "Whatever this is about, he has every right to know the truth." The funeral director sighed deeply and resignedly before continuing with his explanation. "Mr. Rodriguez, your wife came to visit me privately during the week immediately before the fatal accident. She came alone without you and requested that I make certain very specific and unusual arrangements regarding your daughter's burial." James felt the room tilting dangerously around him. "What kind of arrangements?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked that if anything tragic should happen to both her and Sophie, I should ensure that the butterfly necklace Sophie always wore would be delivered to a specific individual rather than being buried with your daughter. The silence in the office became absolutely deafening. James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a drum. "Delivered to whom?" he managed to ask. "To a woman named Rosa Herrera. Your wife provided me with a complete address and very detailed instructions that the necklace should be delivered, along with a sealed letter that Mrs. Rodriguez had written in advance." James looked at Matthew, who was listening with enormous eyes, clearly understanding the profound implications of what he was hearing. "Did you follow those instructions?" "Yes, sir, exactly as requested. Approximately 1 week after the funeral services, I personally drove to Mrs. Herrera's residence and delivered both the necklace and the sealed letter. She appeared very moved and emotional upon receiving them, but she didn't explain to me why your wife had wanted her to have these items. Do you still have a copy of that letter?" Mr. Ramirez shook his head firmly. "Your wife was extremely specific about that particular detail. She insisted there should be only one copy of the letter, which was to be delivered without being read or copied by anyone else." James felt as though he were falling through empty space. Maria had known about Matthew's existence. More than that, she had somehow known about her own impending death, or at least had possessed sufficient foresight to make detailed arrangements for that possibility. And most significantly, she had specifically wanted Sophie's precious necklace to go to Matthew after her death. "Did my wife explain why she wanted to make these arrangements?" James asked. "She told me only that it was crucially important for her 2 children to have something meaningful that would connect them spiritually, even if they never had the opportunity to meet in life." Her 2 children. Those 3 simple words reverberated through the office like church bells. Maria had known that Matthew was James's son. She had carried that knowledge for years, maintaining the secret until her death, but she had made careful arrangements to ensure that someday the truth would be revealed and the family would be reunited. James looked at Matthew, who now had tears streaming down his face, but was struggling valiantly to maintain his composure with that fierce dignity he had displayed from their very first meeting. "Does that mean she knew who I was all along?" Matthew asked with a trembling voice. "Yes," James replied gently. "I believe she knew exactly who you were, and she loved you even though she had never met you." They left the funeral home in contemplative silence, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had discovered. Maria had not only been aware of Matthew's existence, but had actively wanted James to learn about his son. She had used Sophie's necklace as a kind of posthumous message, a carefully planned way to connect her two separate worlds after her death. "Are you angry with her for keeping this secret?" Matthew asked as they walked slowly toward the parking area. James considered the question with great care. Was he angry? There was certainly pain, confusion, and a sense of betrayal mixed with growing understanding, and even admiration for the way Maria had handled an impossible situation with such thoughtfulness and love. "I don't know," James admitted honestly. "My feelings are very complicated right now. But what I do know with certainty is that she loved you deeply, even without having met you. The fact that she wanted you to have Sophie's necklace proves that she wanted you to be part of our family, even after she was gone. Especially after she was gone." That afternoon, while waiting for the official paternity test results that both knew would simply confirm what had become obvious, James made a decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of both their lives. "Matthew," he said as they sat together in the peaceful garden behind his house, "regardless of what any medical paperwork might say, I want you to know that from this moment forward, if you're willing, this is your home, and I am your family." Matthew looked at him with those expressive eyes that James now knew he had inherited directly from him, eyes filled with such intense hope that it was almost painful to witness. "Do you really mean that?" "I mean it with all my heart, but I need you to understand that this won't be easy for either of us. We both have to learn how to be a family together. I've been living alone for 3 years, and you've experienced a very different kind of life from what I can offer here. We're going to need time to figure everything out." "I have all the time in the world," Matthew said with solemn sincerity. "I've been waiting my whole life for this." James smiled, feeling for the first time in years that his future might contain something more meaningful than simply surviving from day to day. "Then we'll take this journey together. We'll make mistakes, we'll have difficult moments, but we'll face everything together as father and son." The months that followed proved to be exactly as challenging as James had predicted, but also infinitely more rewarding than he had dared to hope. Matthew adapted to his dramatically changed circumstances with the remarkable resilience of someone who had learned early to be flexible, but also with the determination of someone who had finally discovered where he truly belonged. There were undeniably difficult periods. Nights when Matthew experienced vivid nightmares about being forced to return to the institutional environment of the children's home. Days when James felt overwhelmed by the enormous responsibility of raising a child who had endured traumas and experiences that he couldn't fully comprehend or address. Occasions when both of them grieved for the people they had lost. Matthew for his beloved grandmother Rosa, James for Maria and Sophie, and had to learn to comfort and support each other through their shared sorrow. But there were also moments of pure, transcendent joy that James had believed he would never experience again. The first time Matthew laughed so hard at something silly that he couldn't stop giggling for several minutes. The afternoon when James discovered Matthew sketching in his professional drafting studio and realized that his son had inherited not only his physical appearance, but also his artistic talents and spatial intelligence. The emotionally powerful evening when Matthew first said, "I love you, Dad," with complete trust and sincerity. Gradually and naturally, the house that had been filled with oppressive silence for 3 long years began to come alive again with the sounds of family life. James hung several of Matthew's best drawings alongside the existing family photographs, creating a visual bridge between past and present. He converted a sunny spare room into a proper art studio for Matthew, complete with professional supplies and equipment. Most importantly, he began cooking elaborate, nutritious meals again and even learned to prepare several of Matthew's favorite dishes from his childhood with Rosa. Matthew flourished in this nurturing environment. With consistent access to healthy food and professional medical care, he grew taller and stronger. With excellent private tutoring and educational support, his natural academic abilities emerged and developed rapidly. Most significantly, with unconditional love and emotional stability, he developed the self-confidence and sense of security that had been suppressed during years of uncertainty and institutional living. 1 year after their fateful first encounter on that busy downtown street, James and Matthew made a special pilgrimage together to visit the graves of Maria and Sophie. Matthew had insisted that he wanted to meet and pay respects to his other family members, as he had begun referring to them with touching reverence. While standing solemnly before the marble headstones, Matthew carefully removed the butterfly necklace that he had worn faithfully throughout this entire transformative year. "I think this should go back to Sophie now," he said quietly with mature wisdom. "She owned it first, and now that we're a real family, I don't need to wear it anymore to feel connected to all of you." James felt tears burning behind his eyes. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" "I'm completely sure. Besides," Matthew smiled with mischievous affection, "you're going to buy me my own special necklace. Now, aren't you? Something that's uniquely mine and represents our new family." James laughed through his emotional tears. "Of course I will." As they gently placed the necklace on Sophie's grave marker, James experienced a profound sense of completion and peace that he hadn't felt since before the tragic accident. Maria had been absolutely right in her planning. Her 2 children were now spiritually connected, not through a physical object, but through the love and genuine family bonds they had built together. "Do you think they're happy about how everything turned out?" Matthew asked thoughtfully. James gazed at the peaceful cemetery, then looked at his son, because that's exactly what Matthew had become, without any reservations or qualifications, and smiled with deep contentment. "I think they're incredibly happy," he said with conviction. "I believe this was always part of the plan, even when none of us could see how it would unfold." As they walked hand in hand back toward their car, Matthew naturally took James's hand in the unconscious, trusting gesture that had become routine between them. It was such a simple action, but one that represented everything they had built together: trust, love, and family. "Dad," Matthew said, using the precious word he had initially been too afraid to speak, "can we stop for ice cream on the way home?" "Absolutely," James replied warmly. "What flavor would you like?" "Strawberry," Matthew said, without hesitation. "I've always wondered what strawberry ice cream tastes like, but I never had the chance to try it." James smiled, suddenly realizing how many wonderful first experiences they still had ahead of them to share. So many simple pleasures that Matthew had never enjoyed and that they could now discover together. "Strawberry ice cream it is," he said with joy. As they drove toward the ice cream shop, James reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. 12 months earlier, he had been a broken, hollow man, defined entirely by his losses, mechanically going through the motions of each day without any real purpose or hope. Now he was a father again, blessed with a son who admired him, needed him, and gave him compelling reasons to embrace each new day with enthusiasm and gratitude. The butterfly necklace had served as the initial catalyst for their reunion, but the real magic had occurred in everything that followed. The difficult conversations, the moments of shared vulnerability, the gradual but steady building of mutual trust and understanding. James had learned that being a father to a 9-year-old boy was completely different from being a father to an infant who grows up gradually under your guidance. Matthew had arrived with his own fully formed personality, his own fears and dreams, his own unique ways of understanding and interacting with the world. He wasn't a blank slate waiting to be written upon, but rather a fascinating book already half completed that James now had the privilege of helping to finish. And Matthew had taught James lessons he had never expected to learn, about resilience and the incredible strength of the human spirit, about finding genuine joy and wonder in the smallest everyday moments, about the critical importance of never taking a single day of happiness for granted. Matthew had entered James's life carrying so little, a few pieces of carefully mended clothing, a necklace that wasn't rightfully his, and an unbreakable dignity that refused to be crushed by circumstances, but had completely transformed James's empty house into a vibrant home filled with laughter, creative projects, music, and that particular wonderful chaos that only children can bring to a household. 2 years after that life-changing encounter on the busy downtown street, James was sitting in his office, reviewing architectural plans for a major new project, when his assistant informed him that he had an unexpected visitor waiting in the reception area. When he emerged from his private office, he found an elegantly dressed elderly woman with intelligent, perceptive eyes that seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have seen her before. "Mr. Rodriguez?" the woman asked with polite uncertainty. "My name is Elena Herrera. I was Rosa's older sister, and I believe we need to talk about Matthew." James felt time suddenly freeze around him. Rosa Herrera had been Matthew's grandmother, the woman who had kept Maria's secrets for so many years and had raised Matthew with such love and dedication. "Please, come into my office," James said immediately, guiding her toward his private workspace. "How can I help you? Is there something wrong?" Elena settled nervously into the chair across from James's desk, clearly struggling with how to begin this obviously difficult conversation. "I've known about you and Matthew for quite some time," she said finally, her voice steady but emotional. "Rosa told me everything before she died. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would come to check on the boy and make sure he was being properly cared for." "Why did you wait so long to contact me?" James asked with genuine curiosity. Eleanor sighed deeply before responding. "Because Rosa made me swear that I would only intervene if Matthew was in danger, or if you proved to be different from the kind of man she believed you to be. I've been observing from a distance, Mr. Rodriguez. I've seen how you've cared for that boy, how you've loved him, as if he had been in your life from the very beginning." James felt a warm sense of validation expanding in his chest. "Matthew is my son. Of course I love him completely." "Yes," Elena said with a sad but knowing smile. "That's exactly what Rosa hoped you would say. But there's something else you need to know. Something important that Rosa couldn't bring herself to tell Matthew before she passed away." James tensed, preparing himself for yet another revelation that might change everything he thought he understood. "Rosa wasn't actually Matthew's biological grandmother," Elena said gently. "She was his great aunt. Matthew's mother, Maria, was the daughter of my older sister, Carmen. Carmen died when Maria was only 15 years old, and Rosa immediately stepped in to raise her as if she were her own daughter." James processed this new information slowly and carefully. "So Rosa was Matthew's mother's aunt, yes, but she loved him with all her heart, as if he were her own grandchild. When Maria died during childbirth, Rosa never hesitated for even a moment. She took that baby and raised him with complete devotion." "Why are you telling me this now after all this time?" Eleanor reached into her handbag and carefully withdrew a yellowed, well-worn envelope that showed signs of having been handled many times. "Because Rosa left this letter for you. She wrote it during her final weeks, explaining everything she had never been able to tell Matthew about his mother, about the circumstances of his birth, about why she made the difficult decisions she did." James accepted the envelope with trembling hands. His name was written on the front in shaky but determined handwriting that spoke of someone struggling against time and failing health. "May I read it now?" "Of course. In fact, Rosa specifically hoped you would read it in my presence, in case you had questions that I might be able to answer." James opened the envelope with extreme care and unfolded several pages covered with small, cramped handwriting. The script was difficult to read, as if Rosa had had much to say and limited strength with which to say it. "Dear Mr. Rodriguez," the letter began, "if you are reading these words, it means that my time on this earth has ended and that Matthew has finally found his way to you, just as I always knew he would. I have kept this secret burden for 10 long years, but I always believed that someday the truth would emerge when the time was right. Secrets, I have learned, have their own way of revealing themselves when the moment is divinely appointed. I want you to understand that your wife Maria was one of the most extraordinary women I have ever had the privilege of knowing. When she first came to work in your beautiful home, my great-niece Maria was 18 years old and struggling desperately to find her place in a world that seemed to offer few opportunities for someone in her circumstances. Her mother had died several years earlier, and I was doing everything within my limited power to keep her in school and provide her with chances for a better life. But we were very poor, and our options were severely restricted. Your wife saw something genuinely special in my Maria from the very first day. She treated her with exceptional kindness and respect, gave her important responsibilities that helped build her confidence, and paid her more generously than the work actually required. But more than that, she provided the maternal guidance and attention that the girl had lost far too young and desperately needed. I don't know the exact details of how or when the relationship between you and my Maria began. What I do know is that she admired you deeply and completely, speaking of you with the kind of reverence that young people reserve for their greatest heroes. I know that you were always gentle and respectful with her, that you never took advantage of her youth or vulnerability, and that when you both realized what was developing between you, you genuinely tried to end it before it could go any further. But I also know that both of you were experiencing profound loneliness in ways that neither of you fully understood at the time. Your wife was struggling with severe depression following several pregnancy losses that had devastated her emotionally. You were working extraordinarily long hours, feeling overwhelming pressure to provide for your family and meet everyone's expectations of your success. My Maria was young, emotionally vulnerable, and desperate to experience the kind of love she had never known. I don't judge either of you for what happened between you. Mistakes of the heart are the most human and understandable of all our failures. When Maria became pregnant, your wife discovered the situation almost immediately. But instead of the anger and rage that my Maria had expected and feared, she encountered understanding and compassion. Your wife told her that she understood exactly why it had happened, that she didn't blame either of you for your human weaknesses, but that the situation was completely impossible to manage within the structure of your marriage. It was actually your wife who suggested that Maria and I should move far away during the pregnancy. She personally paid for the small apartment where we lived during those difficult months, covered all the medical expenses, and provided everything we needed for Maria's health and comfort. The only condition she requested was that the baby should carry our family name rather than yours, in order to protect everyone involved from scandal and complications. My Maria died during childbirth from complications that no one could have predicted or prevented. Her final words were a desperate plea for me to raise Matthew with unlimited love, to never allow him to believe he was unwanted or a mistake, and to tell him someday, when the time was appropriate, who his real father was. Your wife continued sending money to us every single month for years, without your knowledge. Money that I used to ensure Matthew had the best life I could possibly provide. We never lacked for food, clothing, medical, care, or educational opportunities. Your wife made absolutely certain of that. The butterfly necklace came to us after the funeral, along with a heartbreaking letter from your wife, explaining that she wanted Matthew to have something meaningful that would connect him spiritually to his other family. In that letter, she asked me to make sure that when my time came to leave this world, Matthew would wear the necklace in a visible way, hoping that fate would eventually bring you together. Your wife believed deeply in destiny, Mr. Rodriguez. She believed that everything happens for important reasons, even the painful and difficult things. She believed that someday you would encounter Matthew and would recognize him immediately for who he truly was. She was absolutely right. Now that you are together, I want you to know that Matthew is a truly exceptional child. He is intelligent, compassionate, resilient, and possesses a heart capable of loving deeply. Despite all the losses and disappointments he has endured, he represents the very best qualities of both you and my beloved Maria, combined in one remarkable little person who deserves every opportunity and all the love you can give him. Please don't torture yourself with guilt about the past. Don't spend precious time regretting the mistakes that ultimately led you to this moment. Sometimes our errors are the only way the universe can guide us toward where we are meant to be. Care for that precious boy with all your heart. Love him as completely as I know you already do. And always remember that your wife Maria knew this day would come, and she blessed it long before it happened. With my deepest respect and eternal gratitude, Rosa Herrera. James finished reading the letter with tears streaming freely down his face. Elena quietly offered him tissues while allowing him time to absorb and process all of this overwhelming information. Does Matthew know any of these details? James finally asked. Rosa told him only the essential basics before she died, that his mother had loved him beyond measure, that his father was a good man who hadn't known of his existence, and that someday they would find each other. But she didn't burden him with the more complex adult details. Do you think he should know the complete story? Eleanor considered this question very carefully before responding. I believe Matthew deserves to know the full truth when he's emotionally mature enough to understand it completely. But I also believe that the most important truths he already knows, that he is deeply loved, that he belongs somewhere, and that his life has genuine value and purpose. James nodded, carefully folding the precious letter. Elena, may I ask you something personal? Of course. Was Rosa happy during those final years? I mean, truly happy with the decision she made to raise Matthew and keep all these secrets? Elena smiled, warmly, the first completely genuine smile she had shown since arriving. Rosa experienced more joy and fulfillment during the years she spent raising Matthew than during any other period of her entire life. That wonderful boy gave her a sense of purpose and meaning she had never experienced before. He provided her with the opportunity to be the kind of mother she had always wanted to be, but had never had the chance to become. Matthew transformed her from a lonely widow into a beloved grandmother when she thought that chapter of her life was permanently closed. I'm very grateful to know that. And Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to understand that Rosa died completely at peace. She died knowing she had fulfilled every promise she had ever made to care for Matthew until he could find his true home. She died confident that you were exactly the kind of father she had always hoped you would prove to be. After Elena departed, James remained in his office for several hours, reading and rereading Rosa's letter while contemplating all the implications of what he had learned. Maria had not only been aware of Matthew's existence throughout his entire life, she had been instrumental in ensuring his well-being and planning for their eventual reunion. She had financially supported his upbringing, orchestrated their meeting, and given her blessing to a situation that could have easily destroyed their marriage if handled differently. That evening, when James arrived home, he found Matthew in his art studio, working intently on a particularly elaborate and detailed drawing. Over the past 2 years, Matthew's artistic abilities had flourished under the guidance of the most talented instructors James could locate. The boy possessed a rare, natural gift for capturing not only the physical appearance of his subjects, but also their emotional essence and inner spirit. "What are you creating?" James asked, approaching to observe over his son's shoulder. "It's a family portrait," Matthew said without looking up from his concentrated work, "but not of how we are now. It's of the family I imagine we could have been if everyone had been able to live together from the very beginning." James looked at the drawing and felt his breath catch in his throat. Matthew had created a scene of domestic happiness, a man who was unmistakably James, a woman who bore such a strong resemblance to Maria that it couldn't possibly be coincidental, a girl who was clearly Sophie, and a boy who was obviously Matthew himself. They were gathered around a dinner table, all of them laughing together, with expressions of pure joy and contentment on every face. "How did you know what Maria looked like well enough to draw her so accurately?" James asked with amazement. "I've been studying all the photographs very carefully," Matthew admitted, "and you've told me so many detailed stories about her that I feel like I knew her personally, even though we never actually met." James sat down beside Matthew, studying the drawing with a mixture of admiration and something approaching awe. "This is absolutely beautiful, Matthew. Truly extraordinary work. Do you think they would have liked it? Maria and Sophie, I mean." James thought about Rosa's letter, about the tremendous sacrifices Maria had made to protect everyone involved, about the careful way she had planned for their eventual reunion, despite knowing she wouldn't be there to see it. "I think they would have been completely enchanted by it," James said with absolute honesty. "In fact, I believe this represents exactly what Maria hoped would eventually happen." Matthew finally looked up from his artwork, studying James's expression with that perceptive intuition he had developed. "Something happened today, didn't it? You seem different somehow." James smiled at his son's remarkable ability to read people's emotions. Matthew had developed an almost supernatural talent for interpreting the feelings and moods of those around him, probably as a survival mechanism developed during years of having to navigate unpredictable adult behaviors in institutional settings. "I had a very interesting visitor at my office today," James said. "Someone who knew your grandmother Rosa very well." Matthew immediately straightened with full attention. "Who was it?" "Her sister Elena. She came to bring me something that Rosa had written for me before she died." James told Matthew about Elena's visit and about the letter, carefully editing out the more complex adult details while sharing the essential elements. That Rosa had lived with complete happiness while raising him, that Maria had known about him and had wanted them to be reunited, and that everything that had occurred had been part of a larger plan that was bigger than any of them had understood at the time. "Does that mean Maria loved me even before she ever met me?" Matthew asked with wonder. "Yes, absolutely," James said with firm conviction. "She loved you and wanted you to be part of our family from the very beginning." Matthew contemplated this revelation while looking back at his drawing. "Then maybe this picture isn't really about an imaginary family after all," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's about the family we always were, even when we didn't know it existed." The simple wisdom of Matthew's observation struck James with profound force. His son was absolutely right. They had always been a family, just separated by circumstances and secrets, but connected by love and intention that transcended time and space. Maria had been Matthew's mother in every way that truly mattered, caring for him from a distance, planning his future, ensuring he would eventually find his way home. "I think you're exactly right," James said with deep emotion. "I think we were always meant to be a family, just in a way that none of us could understand at the time." That night, James hung Matthew's drawing in the most prominent place in their living room, right next to all the family photographs. It fit perfectly there, completing a narrative that had begun years earlier, with two young people who had made a beautiful mistake, had continued with an extraordinary woman who had found a way to love everyone involved, and now concluded with a father and son who had found their way back to each other against all odds. 3 years after that fateful first encounter on the downtown street, James was sitting in the bleachers of Matthew's school soccer field, watching his son play with skill and confidence on the varsity team. Matthew had grown tall and athletic, maintaining the natural grace he had inherited from Maria, while also developing the steely determination that James recognized as distinctly his own contribution to his son's character. As he watched Matthew sprint across the field, with the ball, James reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of ordinary happiness. He remembered the difficult early days when neither of them had known how to be a family together. He thought about the nights when Matthew had suffered from nightmares and James had felt helpless to comfort him. He recalled the moments of frustration when their vastly different life experiences had created misunderstandings that seemed impossible to bridge. But he also treasured the memories of pure joy that had gradually replaced the pain. The first time Matthew had won an academic award and had rushed home to share his triumph with James. The afternoon when James had discovered Matthew in his professional drafting studio, attempting to design buildings using the same computer programs James used in his architectural practice. The evening when Matthew had confessed that he sometimes dreamed about Sophie, and that in those dreams she told him how happy she was that he had finally found his father. Now watching his son play with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged in the world, James felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Not gratitude for the tragedy that had made their reunion possible, but gratitude for the series of courageous decisions that extraordinary people had made to ensure this moment could exist. Maria, who had found a way to love everyone involved in an impossible situation. Rosa, who had sacrificed years of her life to raise a child who wasn't biologically hers, but had become her greatest joy. Elena, who had honored her sister's promises even after death. And Matthew himself, who had maintained hope and goodness despite years of uncertainty and institutional living. The soccer game ended with a victory for Matthew's team, and James watched his son run toward the stands with that radiant smile that never failed to remind him why every day was worth living fully. "Did you see my goal in the second half?" Matthew asked breathlessly, his face glowing with excitement and athletic achievement. "I saw every single moment," James replied, embracing his son with pride. "You were absolutely magnificent out there. Can we celebrate? Maybe get some of that Hawaiian pizza we had when we first met?" James laughed with pure joy. After all these years, Hawaiian pizza remained Matthew's favorite food, a sweet reminder of that first afternoon when an unknown child had pronounced Hawaiian as if it were the most magical word in the English language. "Hawaiian pizza sounds absolutely perfect," James agreed. As they walked together toward the parking lot, Matthew suddenly stopped walking. "Dad," he said, using the word that now came as naturally as breathing, "do you ever wish things had happened differently? Do you ever regret the way we found each other?" James paused to consider the question seriously. It was something he had pondered many times during the past 3 years. Would he have preferred to know Matthew from birth? Would he have wanted Maria to tell him the truth from the beginning? Would he have chosen to avoid years of pain and secrecy? "You know what I've realized," James said finally. "I think everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to happen. If we had met under different circumstances, maybe we wouldn't appreciate what we have now quite as much. Maybe I wouldn't have been ready to be the father you needed and deserved. And now you're ready." James looked at his son, this remarkable boy who had appeared in his life wearing his dead daughter's necklace and had ended up saving him from a meaningless existence defined only by loss and regret. "Now I'm exactly where I belong," James said with complete certainty. "With you, being your father, building our family together one day at a time." Matthew smiled and took James's hand as they continued walking toward their car. "Me too," he said simply, and those 2 words contained everything that mattered. That night, while Matthew completed his homework and James worked on architectural drawings for a new community center, both of them comfortable in the same room but engaged in their individual activities. James felt that particular sense of contentment that comes from knowing you're living exactly the life you were meant to live. The butterfly necklace had been returned to Sophie, but the connection it had created between all parts of his family was stronger than ever. Matthew now wore his own necklace, a simple chain with a pendant shaped like a house, designed by James and chosen by Matthew to symbolize that he had finally found his permanent home. Sometimes, during peaceful evenings like this one, James could sense the presence of Maria and Sophie, not as painful ghosts from the past, but as loving guardians of the present. They had been there all along, working behind the scenes, to connect him with Matthew through acts of love that had transcended death itself. "Dad," Matthew said suddenly, interrupting James's contemplation, "do you think Maria and Sophie can see us right now?" James looked up from his work and studied his son, who had paused in his studies to gaze thoughtfully at the family photographs and artwork covering their walls. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I feel like they're here with us, especially during moments like this, when we're happy and peaceful, like they're glad that we finally became a real family." James felt that familiar warmth expanding in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced the first time Matthew had called him Dad. "Yes," he said softly but with absolute conviction. "I think they can see us, and I think they're incredibly happy about how everything turned out." Matthew nodded with satisfaction and returned to his homework. James went back to his architectural drawings, but his mind continued to wander through the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment of perfect ordinary happiness. A lost and found necklace that had served as a divine messenger. A chance encounter on a busy street that had become the turning point of two lives. A secret maintained for years that had finally been revealed at precisely the right moment. Decisions made for love rather than convenience. Sacrifices made for the welfare of others rather than personal gain. All of these elements had combined to create something James had thought was lost forever, a genuine family. It wasn't the family he had originally planned or expected. It wasn't the family he had dreamed of during his early years of marriage, but it was the family he needed, the family that had been destined for him from the beginning, even when there seemed to be no possible way it could come to exist. As the evening deepened around them, James watched Matthew finish his studies, organize his books and prepare for bed. It was such a simple, everyday routine, the kind of moment that passes unnoticed until you no longer have it in your life. "Good night, Dad," Matthew said, giving James a quick hug before heading upstairs to his bedroom. "Good night, son," James replied. "I love you. I love you too." After Matthew went to bed, James remained in his study for a few more minutes, absorbing the comfortable silence of a house filled with love and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to be the father Matthew deserved and needed. But tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. James rose to turn off the lights and head to his own bedroom, but first he stopped in front of the gallery of family photographs and artwork in the living room. There they all were, the pictures of Maria and Sophie from the years before tragedy struck, the newer photographs of him and Matthew from their life. Together, and in the center, Matthew's drawing of the family they had always been, even when they didn't know it. James gently touched the frame of Matthew's artwork, feeling a deep spiritual connection to all the people represented in it, those who had died and the one who had been found. "Thank you," he whispered to the quiet air, addressing Maria, Sophie, Rosa, and the mysterious forces of the universe that had orchestrated their reunion. "Thank you for bringing us back to each other." And in the peaceful silence of the night, James could have sworn he felt an answer, not in words, but in the profound sense of peace that filled him, in the absolute certainty that everything had unfolded exactly as it was meant to unfold. The butterfly necklace had fulfilled its sacred purpose. The family's secrets had been revealed and resolved. The broken family had been healed and made whole. And in a beautiful house in the quietest residential neighborhood of the city, a Father and son slept peacefully, knowing they had found exactly what they had been searching for throughout their entire lives, the place where they belonged, the people who loved them unconditionally, and the unbreakable bonds of family that transcend time, space, and even death itself. True love, James had learned, always finds a way to complete the circle, even when that circle takes years to close and requires the intervention of forces far greater and more mysterious than human. Understanding. Some families are born complete, others are forged through choice, determination, and acts of faith that defy all logic and probability. James and Matthew's family had been both, born from love and passion, shaped by loss and hope, and finally reunited by a butterfly necklace that had carried within it all the magic and divine intervention two hearts needed to find each other at precisely the right moment. This has been a story from Real Emotional Stories.